Hi guys. I was looking over some of the information in your chapter 4 lecture and realized that I had meant to explain a few points a little bit more than perhaps I did. So I put together a chapter 4 part 2 lecture covering some of the concepts from last week's lecture a little bit more in depth. So hopefully you guys will have a better understanding for the exam this week and also just for the future. So as you can see in the first photo, this woman is harvesting what looks like wheat. Um, our ancestors were hunters and gatherers and ate almost all unrefined foods. Most of the processing came from cooking. Today, we eat mostly refined foods that have been heavily processed and contain added refined sugars. Refined sugars are chemically identical to natural sugars but do not contain the fiber, vitamins, minerals, and phytochemicals of the original foods. Some examples of refined sugars are white table sugar and syrups. And these are just a couple examples here. In the top picture, the unrefined example is sugarcane. And then in the refined example, we have, of course, table sugar. Then in the bottom example, we have a whole cob of corn. And once that's broken down and refined, one of the end products could be cornflakes or another corn cereal. Refined sugars have been implicated as one of the causes of the obesity epidemic. Current recommendations suggest we consume less refined sugar and processed carbohydrates and more whole grains and whole food sources of carbohydrate. So, what's the difference between whole grains and refined grains? Whole grains contain the whole kernel, including that should say bran, B-R-A-N, bran, germ, and endosperm, whereas refined grains are foods that are processed to remove coarse parts such as the bran and germ, which removes the fiber and some vitamins and minerals. So here's an example. This photo comes right from your text. Here we have the what a typical kernel of grain would look like, a whole grain. The outermost layer, so kind of the shell of the grain, contains the most fiber, and that shell area is known as the bran, and that bran layer contains many vitamins and minerals. As you move into the grain, we have the endosperm, and you can see the arrow pointing to that at the top. So the endosperm is the largest part of the kernel. It's made up primarily of starch, but it also contains most of the kernel's protein, along with some vitamins and minerals. Then, all the way on the bottom, is the germ. The germ is located at the base of the kernel, and it's the embryo where sprouting would occur if that grain were planted. It's a great source of oil and is rich in vitamin E. So during the refining process, what would happen is this whole grain would be taken, broken down through processing, and the bran and the germ would be discarded, leaving only the endosperm, that starchy inner layer, and that is what would be left from the whole grain after the refining process. Now, some companies will turn to enrichment in order to add back in some of the vitamins and minerals that are lost during the processing and removal of the bran and germ. However, this enrichment, as good as it might be, never fully replaces what was removed during the refining process. This table comes right from your text. So talking more about enrichment, since vitamins, minerals, and fiber were lost during processing with the removal of the germ and bran, the U.S. government does require that some of these lost nutrients be added back. So, what we see in this graph here at the right, this line represents whole wheat flour, and a whole wheat flour product is going to contain 100% of these items here. And when you add in, so once the nutrients have been refined, or once the flour has been refined, you're left with this yellow amount of all these vitamins. So you can see how much less it is. And then during the enrichment process, the vitamins that are added are going to be indicated in red. And some of those you'll see are through the roof, right? Over 100%, great source of folate, great source of thiamine, riboflavin. But despite that enrichment process, not all of the nutrients are added back in, and certainly not back up to the level that they once were present in the unrefined product. Empty calories. Refined sugars contain calories but lack fiber and other nutrients. Sugars from whole foods, such as fruit and vegetables, are more nutrient dense. So here's an example of what we're talking about when we say nutrient dense. Here we have an example of a kiwi and some red licorice. So in this example, both contain about the same amount of calories, and both contain about the same in terms of carbohydrate. Remember, carbohydrate, when you're looking at grams per carbohydrate, or grams of carbohydrate, that includes sugars. So right about the same amount of carbohydrate, right about the same amount of calories. The difference is, of course, that with the kiwi, you are getting several hundred milligrams of vitamin C. You're also getting folate and some calcium. So when you're thinking about, okay, I'm looking for a snack, maybe it's about 150 calories, you're going to be getting a lot more bang for your buck with 150 calories worth of kiwi than 150 calories worth of red licorice. And so in this example, we would refer to the kiwi as being much more nutrient dense than the red licorice. This table I'm not going to spend too much time on because it's all information that we went over in the first part of the Chapter 4 lecture, but I did want to make sure to include a different way for you all to see the information organized. So this is showing carbohydrates up at the top. That carbohydrate literally means carbon and water. So we have carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. Then we show how those can be referred to as complex or simple carbohydrates, what it means to be a complex carbohydrate, what it means to be a simple carbohydrate, examples of both of those. We have glycogen, which is the animal storage of carbohydrate. We have starch, which is the plant storage, and we have fiber, which makes up the plant structure. Then on the right, all the way on the right, we have listed there the 3 monosaccharides that we talked about, and then of course the arrows beside them indicating which 2 monosaccharides combine to form which of the 3 disaccharides. So if these were some things that maybe you were having difficulty understanding in the first part of Chapter 4, I would encourage you to really spend some time looking at this, maybe rewriting it yourself, something to really kind of help you to understand the connections here and the similarities and differences between the different carbohydrates listed. Carbohydrate digestion, again, this is something that you learned about in the digestion chapter, and we also talked about it in the last Chapter 4 lecture, but I wanted to just kind of go over it as an overview for you all, just in another way for those of you who maybe had difficulty understanding it before. Um, so carbohydrate digestion. This visual is right from your text, but I really want to just go through in depth the trail and the process of digestion that occurs with carbohydrate. So, as we mentioned in the lab last week when I was kind of going over some study points, chemical digestion does begin in the mouth, and that chemical digestion occurs due to the enzyme salivary amylase. So amylase is a enzyme that's responsible for starting to break down starch, and it's present in our saliva. So, in your mouth, not only do we have mechanical digestion of your teeth really chewing and breaking up foods, but we also have chemical digestion of carbohydrates with salivary amylase. Then, as we move down through the esophagus, we enter the stomach. Once the food reaches your stomach, that salivary amylase is inactivated by the acid in your stomach, and no further digestion occurs. So the stomach for carbohydrates is really acting like a holding site. Um, Not a whole lot goes on here. You know, the muscles of your stomach do kind of churn that carbohydrate around, but it's not actually getting broken down. So for your stomach, more of a holding site, not really any digestion taking place. Then from the stomach, we move on into the small intestine. Here we have pancreatic amylase. Again, we have amylase, so it's an enzyme that digests carbohydrate. Pancreatic just means that that amylase is being secreted by the pancreas, whereas in your mouth we had the salivary amylase. Salivary because it's existing in your saliva. So same enzyme, just a different location. In the small intestine, that pancreatic amylase completes the job of breaking down starch into disaccharides and oligosaccharides. So, again, those are sugar units of 2, 3, maybe 4 units long. And then once those disaccharides reach the villi of the small intestine, which you see in this inset photo here, they become further broken down. So, the villi of your small intestine, you might remember from the chapter on digestion, they're sort of like little finger-like protrusions all around the lining of your small intestine. So, as food moves through your small intestine, it's going to brush up against these villi to be further broken down and absorbed. So these little molecules here are examples of oligosaccharides. So these are 3 sugar units long, and these disaccharides are 2 sugar units long. And they are going to sort of brush past this these villi through the small intestine, and enzymes on the surface of these villi kind of grab these molecules as they're floating by and further break them down into single sugar units here. And those sugar units, you'll remember, are called monosaccharides. Mono meaning one. And once they're broken down into monosaccharides, they're at their smallest size. And because they're so small at that point, those monosaccharides are able to be absorbed into directly into the lining of the small intestine, into these villi. And in each villi, you have a tiny, tiny little vein and artery. And so those monosaccharides will be absorbed directly into your blood vessel through the villi, and then those blood vessels will cart the monosaccharides off to the liver to be processed. In the large intestine, that's where we see fiber. So fiber kind of hangs out down in the large intestine with other indigestible carbohydrates. They do get partially broken down, but not really a whole lot, and they certainly don't get absorbed into the body. Fiber we'll talk about, I think, a little bit more in terms of how it works to regulate your digestive system. But it does just kind of hang out in the large intestine for a while, helping to regulate the digestive process, and then it's eventually excreted in waste. Small intestine enzymes. So we talked about the enzymes that exist along the villi here that work to break down these sugar units into monosaccharides. Those enzymes, we have maltase. So maltase breaks down maltose. So we have that ase suffix again, where ase is indicating to us that it's an enzyme, and we have maltose, that OSE suffix, indicating to us that it's a sugar. So maltose, we know, is made up of 2 glucose molecules. The maltase enzyme goes in, breaks up the maltose into 2 single glucose molecules. Sucrase, same idea, works on sucrose, breaking it down into its 2 monosaccharide units, 1 fructose and 1 glucose. Finally, we have lactase. Lactase breaks down lactose into its 2 monosaccharide units, which we know are galactose and lactose. So at this point, all the polysaccharides have been broken down into single sugar units. So talking about lactase, we might as well chat a little bit more about lactose intolerance. An individual that has lactose intolerance has low levels of that lactase enzyme. Without that lactase enzyme, it's difficult for lactose, or milk sugar, to be broken down into its monosaccharide parts. This means that the lactose doesn't get broken down in the small intestine and continues on into the large intestine, where it's digested by bacteria. So because the lactose isn't broken down by enzymes and it's being broken down by bacteria later, that digestion by the bacteria causes a release of gas, which can cause abdominal distension, cramping, and diarrhea. For those who are not able to digest dairy very well, sources of calcium can be tofu, legumes, dark green vegetables, canned salmon and sardines, some calcium fortified foods, calcium supplements, or lactase treated milk. So it's important to remember when we talk about proteins, we'll be talking about allergies, and how your body, if it has a food allergy, is having a reaction to a protein in a particular food. Now, lactose intolerance is not an allergy. You're not allergic to milk. You're not having an allergic reaction to the protein. It's a food intolerance, and that food intolerance is based on your body being unable to process that lactose sugar because of the lack of the enzyme lactase. And lactose intolerance, you may or may not know, does have some regional components to it. I'm just going to kind of go over this very, very briefly, but this is in your text, showing different rates of lactose intolerance all over the world. And in regions that have higher lactose intolerance, we actually see that if we look at the diets in those regions, there isn't a heavy reliance on dairy as we consume it here in the United States. And so because there isn't a high reliance on dairy in those areas, individuals who live in those areas or maybe immigrate from those areas, their bodies have not evolved in a way that they have the same amount of the lactase enzyme as we do, because they haven't needed it. So that we do see, because of that, because of how our bodies have evolved differently in different parts of the world, we do see differing rates of lactose intolerance around the globe, depending on what the diet looks like. So here's where we're going to talk more about fiber and other indigestible carbohydrates. So I talked about how even though fiber isn't digested and it just kind of hangs out in the large intestine, it actually is very, very important to how your digestive system works. So here on the left-hand side, there's an example of the lower digestive system with a high fiber meal. And then on the right, we have an example of the digestive system with a low fiber meal. And down on the bottom here, we have this graph of a blood sugar spike, all right? So the green line is showing a low fiber meal. So maybe this is, you go out and get some food at McDonald's. So you go out and get some food at McDonald's, doesn't have a lot of fiber in it. You eat it, and right after you eat it, you get this blood sugar spike. And then your body's going to digest that food. You'll notice here in this example, all the food is kind of clumped together, really clumped together in one space in the digestive system. So it's going to move through as kind of like this dense ball of food through your body. And it's going to move through really fast. You're going to have that blood sugar spike. Then you're going to have a little bit of a plummet in your blood glucose as that big ball of food moves through really quickly and is excreted. Then your liver releases some glucagon. The glucagon will go and get some blood sugar from your glycogen stores, thus restoring your blood sugar level back to normal. Now we compare this to a high fiber meal. Let's say you have like a wild rice with some meat of some kind and some roasted vegetables for dinner. This meal is going to contain a lot more fiber, and you'll notice even with the same amount of food, the difference that we see here is that the fiber really spreads that food out along your digestive system. So it doesn't just move through in one great big lump. It really takes its time and moves through, allowing the necessary nutrients to be taken out. And what that does is it not only allows more nutrients to be extracted from that food, but it also allows your body to feel fuller longer. So you're not feeling like you need to hurry up and eat again. And what we see there in terms of blood glucose is after you eat that high fiber meal, we follow this orange line, and you have a little bit of a blood sugar increase, not nearly as high as with the other meal, and then it kind of gradually goes back down and levels out. So it's not that severe spike followed by a drop where the food is really rushing through your digestive system. So as I said before, even though fiber isn't digested and absorbed into the body, it does play a really critical role in the maintenance of your digestive system and the speed with which food moves through your body. Glycemic index versus load versus response. These are definitions that they're terms that you probably see in your text or maybe things that you've heard. So I just want to kind of clear them up for you in terms of the differences between each of them. So glycemic index is a ranking of how a food affects blood glucose relative to an equivalent amount of carbohydrate from a reference food, such as white bread or pure glucose. So glycemic index is something that is used sometimes by diabetics to understand how a particular food is going to affect their blood glucose once they eat it. Now, the higher the glycemic index, the larger the effect. So an example here is white bread having a glycemic index of 100 and kidney beans having a glycemic index of 25. And so, certainly in this example, the white bread would have a much more severe impact on an individual's blood glucose than the kidney beans. Then we have glycemic load, which compares the effect of typical portions of food on blood glucose, and glycemic response, which is the measure of how quickly and how high blood glucose levels rise after carbohydrate consumption. All right? So just a little information, I actually don't believe that these three terms are on the exam. So you don't have to worry about memorizing them, but I know things that we hear about out in the media, or maybe from our friends or family or ourselves if we have diabetes. So I think it's really important to know, especially when we're chatting more about carbohydrates. All right, so I want to talk a little bit more about carbohydrate function. Some of this is really going to be a repeat from the first half, but I want to make sure that you guys understand it and maybe present it in a different way to give you a better understanding. So maintaining blood glucose. Your fasting blood glucose is typically between 70 and 110 milligrams per deciliter, and we know that your blood glucose is regulated by two hormones, insulin and glucagon. Now, you are definitely going to have to understand the difference between insulin and glucagon for your exam. So, big asterisk next to this. You're not going to have to write all of this out, but you should understand that when your blood glucose is elevated, when you have an increased blood glucose, insulin is secreted. The extra glucose that's in your blood is taken up into cells, leading to a decrease in your blood glucose. When your blood glucose starts out really low, when it starts out decreased, glucagon is secreted and glucose is released from your glycogen stores in the liver, increasing that blood glucose back up to normal. So again, something that we covered in the last lecture, but I just wanted to kind of explain it a little bit differently, just in case the first lecture maybe was confusing. Ketones. I really wanted to include a slide about ketones. Ketones were something that not until just recently, I mean, ketones were something that we used to really only talk about when we talked about diabetes. But now there's been sort of this emergence of a keto diet. And I think that with the keto diet, a lot of people really don't understand what exactly ketones are and how they function in the body, and that they're not really good for you. So I just wanted to include a slide here to kind of go over that a little bit more. And of course, there's more detail in your text. But ketones or ketone bodies are acidic molecules produced by fat breakdown when carbohydrates are not available for cells. Your heart, muscle, and kidneys can use these for energy. Your brain does adapt after about 3 days to use ketones, and these ketone bodies are produced with starvation, low carb diets, and are seen in poorly managed diabetes. Ketosis is the term used to describe increased ketones in the body, and ketoacidosis is having acidic blood from increased ketones. So the acidic molecules are formed because your body doesn't have enough glucose, it doesn't have enough carbohydrate. So your body is like really struggling to find a place to get that energy from. So it breaks down fat molecules, but not only does the breakdown of fat molecules provide you with energy, but it also creates an acidity to your blood that really isn't healthy in the long term. So, just something to think about and really research more if that's something that you're thinking about trying, or somebody that you know maybe is thinking of trying. I'm going to go touch on a couple more things for carbohydrates in health and disease. We talked about type 1 and type 2 diabetes and also prediabetes, but I'm not sure if we touched on gestational diabetes, so I wanted to make sure to mention it here. Gestational diabetes is diabetes during pregnancy, specifically. Typically, with gestational diabetes, you have a baby that's larger for its gestational age, so that means for it might be a larger size than what is considered typical for a baby at like 5 months gestation or 7 months gestation. Typically, gestational diabetes resolves after pregnancy. However, it does increase the risk of a woman's does increase a woman's risk for type 2 diabetes later in life. So it is something that you want to avoid. And if you are pregnant or if you know somebody who is, their doctors are typically really good about monitoring blood glucose for a pregnant woman, simply because it does create some risk of complication and health effects later for the baby and also for the mother. So blood glucose is something that doctors really want to keep in check for those that are expecting. And symptoms for diabetes, early symptoms of diabetes, we see this sometimes with pre-diabetes, but not always and not all of these symptoms. So it's another reason why it's important to see your doctor regularly and have your blood glucose checked. But some early symptoms include frequent urination, excessive thirst, blurred vision, and weight loss. And long-term complications include damage to the heart and blood vessels, kidneys, eyes, and nerves. We have hypoglycemia. Hypoglycemia refers to low, very low blood sugar. Hyperglycemia would be high blood sugar. So, hypoglycemia is very low blood sugar. Possible causes include poorly managed diabetes. This might be if an individual takes too much insulin, right? And what's too much insulin going to do? It's going to cause too much of that glucose to be pulled up and stored as glycogen, and not enough is going to be circulating in the blood. Can also be excessive exercise or an inadequate food intake. Could also be caused by abnormalities in your own body's insulin production or abnormalities in the way the body responds to insulin. In healthy people, hypoglycemia can be treated with smaller, frequent meals, more fiber-rich foods versus foods high in simple sugars, and also an adequate protein intake. When we talk about sugars, we need to also mention dental caries, which is another word for cavities. We know that you have salivary amylase in your mouth, that enzyme breaking down carbohydrates, but we also have bacteria in our mouth. And that bacteria, when it digests carbohydrates, produces an acid, and that acid works to damage our tooth enamel. So for somebody that might have a cavity, some of those causes might be frequent snacking, consuming foods that stick to the teeth, sucking on hard candy, or slowly sipping soda. Weight management, we talked about this a little bit last time, but I wanted to just reiterate that carbohydrates themselves are not the enemy, and carbohydrates are actually a really important part of a healthy diet. And so rather than limiting total carbohydrates, we should really instead be thinking about the types of carbohydrates that we're eating. So with the increased popularity in low carb diets, carbohydrates have really kind of gotten a bad rap. The type of carbohydrates consumed is what's really important. Diets high in simple carbohydrates do not provide satiety and add a lot of empty calories to the diet. They cause a rapid rise in blood glucose and stimulate the release of insulin, which may promote fat storage. They can also cause a bit of a sugar addiction, which causes you to constantly crave that sugar. Whereas diets high in unrefined carbohydrate, so these are whole grains that contain, the germ, the bran, and the endosperm, add bulk to your meals, slow your digestion down, increases the sense of fullness, and allows you to feel full with less food. Non-nutritive artificial sweeteners replace added sugar in the diet. The pros are that they do decrease dental caries and they control blood sugar. However, Artificial sweeteners have been associated with weight gain, are present in low nutrient dense foods, and are toxic at high doses. My recommendation in terms of sugar is just to eat less sugar. Rather than looking for ways to artificially substitute in chemicals to take the place of sugar so that you can still eat the same foods. Moderation is much, much, much better than adding in any sort of artificial sweetener. Also, they are associated with weight gain. Part of this, there is some research out there to suggest that the consumption of artificial sweeteners actually has a detrimental effect on how your body digests sugar. Also, because a lot of artificial sweeteners are in foods that are unhealthy to begin with, you might be eating a food that would normally be sugary because it has artificial sweeteners, but it still has tons of fat and is really unhealthy for you. So I think that there's also this sort of misconception that a food that doesn't have any sugar must be good for me, when that's really not the case. I'm not going to go into each of these in depth. You don't really need to know anything about them for the exam, but I thought it would be important to point out that these are included in Table 4.1 in your text. A really good detailed breakdown of each of these different non-nutritive sweeteners that we see on the market. So if you're interested, I would encourage you to check that out. Heart disease. Heart disease also has a root in carbohydrates. High sugar diets do increase blood lipid levels. High blood glucose damages your blood vessels. Soluble fiber decreases cholesterol absorption and synthesis. So more soluble fiber, lower cholesterol, good idea. High fiber diets also have been shown to decrease blood pressure, weight, blood glucose, and heart disease. Diets high in fruits and vegetables also increase fiber and protective antioxidants. So, in short, what we see here is that fiber, fruits, vegetables, all these things are really great for your heart health, your blood health, lowered cholesterol. And for somebody that's just eliminating carbohydrates from their diet or drastically reducing carbohydrates from their diet, they're really missing out on all of these benefits. Okay, so again, I have to reiterate, it's not carbohydrates as a whole that are the enemy. It really is important to look at the type of carbohydrate that you're consuming. Bowel health. High fiber diets decrease constipation as long as adequate water is consumed. They decrease hemorrhoids, diverticula, and colon cancer. There aren't a lot in terms of studies that support the high fiber diets decrease colon cancer directly, but there is certainly an association there. And diverticulitis, for those of you that maybe don't know, diverticulitis occurs in the large intestine. And what we see in this photo here, and this is in your text, we see these little outpoachings here. So what happens is you have your large intestine, which is generally pretty smooth on the inside. And when you get what's known as diverticula are these little sort of caves, these little sort of pockets that form on the side of your large intestine. You can see one here in this x-ray. What happens then is what's really waste at this point in your large intestine is everything good's been absorbed in the small intestine. Now it's just going through the large intestine to be excreted as waste. It's moving along. If somebody has diverticulitis and they have these little pouchings here, what happens is that waste material, some of it gets lodged in these little pockets in the wall of your large intestine as it's moving through. And when it gets lodged there, it can get stuck for a little while, and that can actually cause you to have an infection in these little pouches. Can also be an issue if you're eating a lot of nuts and seeds. You get sort of the hulls from those seeds. They don't get digested. They don't get absorbed through the small intestine. So those little seed pieces, as they move through the large intestine, are a great example of something that can be lodged in those diverticula. So it's a little overview of diverticulitis. Meeting your carbohydrate needs. Here are some of those definitions we talked about in lab, some of those definitions you should know. Ding, 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 ding. You want to make sure that you consume enough carbohydrate to meet your glucose needs and choose types for health and disease prevention. The RDA for carbohydrate is 130 grams per day. The AMDR, or acceptable macronutrient distribution range for carbohydrate, is 45 to 65% of your total calorie intake should be coming from carbohydrates. Now, again, it's about half. It's a good way to remember it, and it is the largest. So the largest portion of your total calories should come from carbohydrates. Adequate intake, AI, another definition you should know. Adequate intake for fiber is 38 grams per day for men and 25 grams per day for women. This is really high. So adequate intake is how much you should be consuming on a daily basis to meet your needs, and 25 grams per day for women, 38 grams per day for men. A typical American diet does not come close to meeting these. In order to meet your daily fiber needs, you really have to kind of think about it, because just a traditional diet just isn't going to cut it. 2015 to 2020 dietary guidelines. This is, of course, where we are right now. This includes a recommendation to limit added sugar intake to less than 10% of calories. So added sugar isn't, we're not talking about fruits and vegetables here. We're talking about like added sugar, like cookies, pastries, that sort of thing, sugar sweetened beverages. For a 2,000 calorie diet, this means limited added sugar intake to less than 200 calories per day, or about 12 teaspoons. So that means you should limit your added sugar intake to no more than one 20-ounce bottle of sugar sweetened beverage. And we're not just talking soda. Sweetened iced tea products, sweetened juices, things like Gatorade, other sports drinks, those are all considered sugar sweetened beverages. A little bit more about choosing carbohydrate wisely. Again, the dietary guidelines and MyPlate focus on increasing whole grains, fruits and vegetables, and reduced fat dairy products, limiting foods high in refined grains and added sugars. The dietary guidelines specifically recommend reducing intake of sugar sweetened beverages, and MyPlate recommends 6 ounces of grains, half of which should be whole, 2 cups of fruit, and 2.5 cups of vegetables a day for a 2,000 calorie diet. These last few slides are really just for your information. They're not going to be on the exam. When you're looking at a nutrition facts panel, this is just kind of giving you a breakdown of where to look for information regarding carbohydrates. So on the nutrition facts panel, you'll see this little circled area here. It's going to tell you the total amount of carbohydrates in a particular food, and then broken down below it, you will see both the dietary fiber and the sugars listed. The daily value down at the bottom, that's just telling you what the nutrition facts are based on. And then when you look in the ingredients label, for example, this product is whole wheat bread. If it is a whole grain product, it will say whole at the beginning of it, and it will say whole wheat flour. If you really have to, this is where you have to check, because sometimes like you might just buy wheat bread and you think, oh, it's whole wheat. No, if you look in the ingredients, the very first ingredient should be a whole grain. If it's not, it might say enriched wheat flour. That's not whole wheat, that's enriched. That's that graph we had earlier where they take out the nutrients and only add some of them back in. A product might say made with whole grains. If it says made with whole grains, that might mean that it contains a little bit of whole grain way down here at the bottom, but it's not the main ingredient. So again, you really want to look out for some of that tricky messaging, and if you're trying to buy a whole grain product, make sure it says whole and make sure it's the first ingredient listed there. A little bit more about interpreting food labels. If a food is labeled high fiber, by law, it has to contain 20% or more of the daily value per serving, whereas foods labeled as a good source of fiber contain between 10 and 19% of the daily value per serving. Interpreting food labels, again, this is from your text, a little bit more information about um, where to find carbohydrates, where to find sugars, where to find fiber on food labels of some common products. All right, so I promise that's it for chapter 4. I hope that helps provide some clarification on some items and give you some more information about some topics that maybe were unclear or maybe you wanted more information about. Again, you do have an exam coming up this Thursday. Please let me know if you have any questions or if I can make any of this more clear for you. Good luck studying, and I'll see you all soon.